bottom line, social pain is a survival threat from your brain's perception as long as you don't have bigger survival threats going
Right.
on.
So from that perspective, then, in our comfortable modern, world, the social fear, that's the biggest monster that's lurking in the closet inside of us, right? That's the big one that most of us need to confront. Welcome to Universal Man. My name is Mark Wepp, and I'm here to help you sharpen your masculine edge. And in this video, well, I've got something a little different for you guys. I've got an interview with Dr. Loretta Breuning, who is a evolutionary psychologist who has some very interesting information for you. I know that when I read her book, I Mammal, it really opened my eyes to something that I think is vastly misunderstood and underdiscussed, which is the natural human appetite for status. I think that moving forward, talking about status is going to be a big part of Universal Man because, this whole masculinity idea, a lot of it has to do with establishing dominance and establishing, using your aggression to, maintain power. And all of that stuff is directly connected to status. And so whenever I think when I'm going to introduce like a new big piece, a big concept or whatever, I want to try and, as much as possible, start it with a conversation, with a discussion. So, I felt like this interview was a great place to start, especially since I think her concepts and the things that she talks about are just, they need to be out there more and they're just not. So you guys got to let me know if you like this longer form kind of video. I did a shorter one yesterday, so maybe I'll just keep mixing it up. But yeah, I hope you guys get a lot out of this interview. Welcome to Universal Man. And today joining us, we have Dr. Loretta Breuning. Thank you so much for coming on the show with us today. Why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself and tell everyone a little bit about your background and your experience.
Okay, well, thank you for having me. I don't know how much detail you want. So I was a professor of management for 25 years, and I took early retirement as soon as I could while I still had a few brain cells left and wanted to start writing books about evolutionary psychology, which is a very short answer.
Yeah.
And I was learning about the brain chemistry that we've inherited from earlier animals and how it causes the good feelings we have and the bad feelings we have. And it's not like a simple either or of hardwired versus culture, but in the middle, what happens is every time one of your brain chemicals turns on, happy or unhappy, it connects neurons that wire you to repeat that response. So every one of us is wired by our unique individual life experience, mostly early experience, because that's when we have the most neuroplasticity. So I've been writing books about that, and then I've been trying to promote that message in every other way I could think of, mostly free ways.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
Yeah, she's got some great videos out on her YouTube channel where she does a really good job of explaining kind of like meeting your happy chemicals. I think that's the name of one of your books, right? Yeah, she's got Meet Your Happy Chemicals, teach you about.
If I could interrupt.
Oh, sure.
That was the original self-published title, but it got picked up by Simon & Schuster. Long story short, it's now called Habits of a Happy Brain. Retrain your brain to boost your serotonin, dopamine, oxytocin, and endorphin levels.
Oh, okay. Thank you. Thank you for correcting me on that. I think I looked at the other version. But
yeah.
So that's all really great stuff, and it's really useful to know. Like it's kind of like the instruction manual for working with your brain. But the thing that I've found in your work that is the most interesting to me is your work on status. Your book, I Mammal, was an eye-opener for me. And I think it's something that really needs to be talked about, particularly in this sphere of masculinity. So, what can you tell us about status? Why should we care about it? Isn't that the opposite of what we're supposed to do? Aren't we supposed to, make status the last thing on our minds?
Well, people say that, but even the people who say that are not doing that because we are inherited from animals who cared about status. Anyone who has spent time with animals has observed that they really obsess over status, and they have very hierarchical groups. And this is quite a taboo right now in academia. And so they're producing lots of studies that suggest that animals are altruistic and egalitarian. They do that by running a lot of studies and finding the one instance that they could construe as an egalitarian behavior.
Mm.
And I'm not saying we shouldn't be, respectful of others. But in order to do that, it's darn hard because we've inherited a brain that is always looking for the one-up position.
Mm.
Now, what does the one-up position mean? I don't think it's useful to define it from a socioeconomic perspective, because then you get into all these preconceived theories. The way your brain looks at it is it's always comparing you to others. So whatever others are in the room or you're putting in your mind, that's who it's comparing yourself to. And when you compare favorably, it releases a good feeling. When you compare unfavorably, it releases a bad feeling.
Hmm. Okay. Okay. So, so a big part of how we feel is determined by the way that our brain perceives our status in any given situation. Is that right?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Okay. So why? Why does our brain care about status?
Great. I'll explain how it works in animals, and then we could think about how it works in people.
Okay.
And it is all about, interestingly, reproductive success is what evolutionary psychology is about. Now, this has been controversial, it's gotten a bad name in all different departments. So first, I just want to start with it applies just as much to females as males. But what brings reproductive success in females is slightly different, but not completely. It's social alliances and risk taking, and it's having strength. Now, for females, strength is used in one way. For males, strength is used in another way. Not completely, but the bottom line is that these are sort of the qualities that give us a sense of social importance because they spread our genes.
Okay. So the reason why we care about status is because, status was how you reproduced in the past. It was pretty much like, if you were the higher status male, then you had probably more resources, or probably a better protector, that sort of thing. So you became more attracted to females, and in turn, were able to pass on your genes. So we are pretty much the progeny of people who, developed enough status to reproduce, right?
People and animals. And to add one more thing, the strength for males is not just to protect and attract,
Okay.
but to fend off other males.
Right.
So the small
competitive, the ability to be an adept competitor.
Exactly. And when studies of females, they do the same thing. Females are competitive, both for resources, for males, and to push their children ahead. And ironically, the species that's now all politically correct, the bonobo, those females are the most competitive. And guess what they're competing for? For the son of the highest status female. And that son has not earned this position. He has not necessarily, become stronger. So it's just a deeply ingrained behavior. It's amazing. If you look at every species, it's slightly different, but the same old story. It's unbelievable.
Okay. So we've got this, status hungry appetite, and this part of us that's appetite for status. Now, how would you compare this appetite for status to, say our appetite for food or appetite for sex? Like, is it like that big or that important?
Yes. Well, thank you. I could tell you read the book. So, what I explain in the book is that our appetite for status actually comes before. It's like even more profound and more immediate than our appetite for food and sex. Because in the state of nature, you can't get food and sex without first having status. And when I say status, again, it's not this fixed abstraction. What it is the perception in each moment when an animal says, should I reach for that food? Should I reach for that mating opportunity? And most of the time, the animal will restrain itself, because if you reach in the presence of a stronger individual, you get bitten, and in the state of nature, that will slow you down and you'll get wiped out by a predator. So when you have the confidence to say, I'm big enough, I'm safe enough and strong enough to reach for that opportunity, that's the positive feeling. It's actually serotonin. We can talk about that. That's the positive feeling that is the kind of the go for it that we're calling status. It's the perception of strength.
Okay. Okay, so that's really interesting then. So like in order for like you're saying it's almost like, more fundamental than your appetite for sex or your appetite for food, because if you fail in that status calculation, might be game over for you and your genes, right? So,
And also the other side is, if you don't risk that, then you're not going to get the food or the opportunity, because you're never going to go for it.
Right, exactly. So this is where we get our, society's emphasis on self-esteem, really, right? Like why everyone always brings it back. Oh, you gotta feel good about yourself. You've got to affirm yourself, because really that's at the root of our neurochemical chain that determines how we show up in the world and then our ability to, pursue the things that we want, right?
That's absolutely true. But from a societal and classroom standpoint, it's not just about feeling good about yourself and being happy. It's
Okay.
if I can have an internalized sense of my own value, then I don't need to keep getting into fights to prove it. That's
Right.
one way to look at it. And the other is that in the human world, as opposed to the animal world, when we invest effort, it's not just for immediate rewards, but long-term rewards. So the simplistic example would be a person who goes to the gym for many months in order to have a look that they're proud of. Now, and I'm not advocating that, I'm just using an example.
Uh-huh.
Now, if you don't have the expectation of a reward 6 months from now, then you're not going to take the steps. The same thing, if I want to be a doctor or a lawyer, I have to take a lot of steps now that I'm not going to get the rewards until later. So it's what you're calling self-esteem. It's the expectation that I can take these steps and get this reward at some time in the future.
Okay. So now, if this is how it works, like what am I trying to say? I feel like there's a distinction then we have to make around what we're calling status here. So like, do we have any drives that are not connected to status?
Yes.
Okay.
First, I have to say that because the word status is so controversial,
Uh-huh.
I changed the subtitle of the book. So it's now called I Mammal: How to Make Peace with Your Animal Urge for Social Power.
Social power. Okay.
Social power sort of gets into this more fungible sense that it's not a fixed social determined thing, but it's your perception of whoever you're comparing yourself to in that moment. Now, so your question was, what is that our only drive, or
Sure.
what are the other drives? Okay, so as I explain in my books, there's 4 different kinds of happiness: dopamine, serotonin, oxytocin, and endorphin.
Mm-hmm.
Serotonin is the one that's about raising your status and gives you the positive feeling when you think you compare favorably.
Okay.
Now, dopamine is the one that's released when you expect a reward, and that triggers the go for it feeling. So, and then I'll get to the others, but just to distinguish serotonin and dopamine. So let's say I'm a monkey, you're a monkey, and there's a banana between us, and
Mhm.
I have to decide whether I'm going to reach for that banana or hold back and let you get it. Now, if I decide that you're stronger than me and I don't want to get bitten, I hold back, you get the banana, you get the serotonin. Now, you may not be hungry because you've already had a whole bunch of bananas. So
Uh-huh.
you may be a big man and offer me the banana. So I may get to eat after all, but I don't get the serotonin. Okay?
Okay.
So that's the serotonin thing. But now let's say that the banana is at the top of the tree, and I have to decide if I'm going to go through all the effort of climbing the tree. So that's the dopamine piece of it. It's like I see a reward far away. I have to make a decision about how much investment I'm going to make to
Mm-hmm.
go after it. Now, part of the decision is if I look at the top of the tree, I see the banana, but I also see you're right next to it. And I decide, oh, I'm not going to go for it if there's a bigger guy or someone's going to get it first.
Uh-huh.
So we're always making a decision of when to go for it with a number of variables, one of them being status, one of them being how big is the reward, one of them is how much is the effort, how far do I have to climb, and is that a safe tree for me to climb in, and do I have the strength to make the climb?
Okay. Okay. So tell me if this sounds right. This is the way I've been kind of thinking about it, is that dopamine is that feeling that moves you toward trying to get that serotonin reward. Because like dopamine is pretty much like it's anticipation. Serotonin is the payoff. Is that right?
Uh, that might apply in certain specific
Okay.
goals that you're having in mind.
Okay.
For example, like courtship, you may be thinking of.
Okay.
But first, let me explain it more generally. Um, a reward could be a lot of different things.
Okay.
And dopamine is the expectation that if I take a particular step, I will get the reward. Now, what is the reward I expect? One reward could be status. Another reward could be filling your belly, which is more immediate. And if you can't pay your mortgage, then it's sort of the same as the filling your belly circuit.
Mm-hmm.
And there's the social acceptance reward, oxytocin, that we haven't spoken about yet. And I may add that sexual arousal is related to oxytocin. And so that's another whole reward, but it's also the safety of social support. Like if you go to a bar and everybody says, "Hey, there's Mark.
Uh-huh.
Yes, hey, I'm glad Mark's here." You know that. So, or if you get into a fight and your friends come and protect you. So that's all the oxytocin department. And the expectation of if I'm looking for a parking lot, if I'm looking for a parking spot in front of the bar where I expect to have a good feeling, then that's a dopamine like anticipation, but the reward is oxytocin.
Okay. Okay. I got you now. So yeah, there's different kinds of rewards you're going for, and sometimes it's going to be that serotonin sort of based reward, the status one, but then other times there are other needs kind of being met and whatnot.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Wonderful. So what's different about the way humans interact with status versus the way animals interact with status? There's got to be some difference, right? We're not just, I'm not just a gorilla over here beating my chest, at least not explicitly, right?
Very good. Yes. Very good. So you've probably heard about various brain structures, but I'll just very simply. So there's the core of the brain, which is often called the limbic system. And then there's the cortex, which is the external covering. And that's really what cortex means, is the external covering.
Hold on real quick. Just before I forget, is the brainstem a part of the limbic system, or are they separate? Separate. Okay, it's the same.
Oh, good question. You know what? Different people use the terms differently. And currently in academic psychology, all these terms are not used and are sort of taboo.
Okay.
They use, each little separate one and don't acknowledge the systems. So when the systems were first discussed, it was called three systems:
Mm-hmm.
the brainstem, the limbic system, and the cortex. In my work, I grouped what's called the reptile brain into the mammal brain, because every mammal also has a reptile brain.
Okay, that makes sense, because that's the way I've been referring to it, as kind of we got this higher mind and this primal mind. And so I'll stop interrupting you. I just wanted to make sure that I was kind of, at least somewhat okay in that terminology. So you were saying that, all right, we've got the difference between us and animals in the way we interact with status.
By the way, in terms of that terminology, I never say that. I never say a higher mind and primal mind.
Yeah, that's me.
Yeah. And that's what most of the non-academic writers say. The reason I don't say that is because it gives the impression that there's a good guy and a bad guy in your brain, and the primal is the bad guy, and then the good guy is fighting it. And that is not true, not even the slightest.
I would agree with that. And that's why I don't call it the lower brain. I think
Yeah.
the primal brain is where we got to get our energy and our power from. And that's really what this course is about, or this Universal Man's about. It's like learning how to work with that inherent emotional engine rather than against it. So, I have a great respect for the primal mind. In many ways, it's tremendously sophisticated. It's responsible for getting us here, and it still runs so much of our power. So I want to make it clear that that's not what I'm saying. It's not this bad mind. It's just sometimes it's a little stupid.
What it is it's wired from past experience.
Yeah.
So your chemicals are wired from whatever turned on your chemicals in your youth. But your cortex is equally stupid because that is also wired from past experience. So you could think of your cortex as a filter. So the world is constantly flooding you with more detail than you could possibly process. And your cortex is like that first line of filtering that's saying, what's important enough to channel up to my limbic system, to act on, to feel either positively or negatively about. So that's part of it.
So it just popped in my head. Maybe instead of higher and primal, I could go with like, how does executive versus energetic brain sound?
That's okay, but the executive part of your cortex is only part of it. So you probably heard people talk about the prefrontal cortex.
Yeah.
And there's the rest of the cortex, like the visual cortex, the occipital cortex. So if we wanted a one hyphenated word, it's actually the pattern-seeking brain. That's what the cortex is. It's a pattern-seeking engine. So it looks for patterns in this overwhelming, massive detail that's always flooding into your eyes and ears. And it's saying, how can I find the patterns that are relevant to my experience right this minute? So I got to ignore everything that's not relevant to what I need in this moment. And that's why you are so amazed sometimes, like, oh, I noticed this, now I notice that, because your brain is always scanning for the patterns that help you meet the unmet needs of that moment.
Okay, so this, analytic part of our brain, this pattern-seeking part of our brain, that's the cortex, and so our cortex obviously is much bigger than animals' cortex, right? For the most part. So from that standpoint, what does that do to our relationship with status?
Okay, and also to get to your point about, what makes us different from animals. That's right. That's where we were going. Okay, so the fascinating thing is the size of the cortex is progressive, you could see in animals versus humans, but the size of the prefrontal cortex is also hugely different. So our prefrontal cortex is 4 times bigger than a gorilla, whose prefrontal cortex is like 4 times bigger than a dog. And then as you get smaller and smaller, they have almost no prefrontal cortex at all. Okay. So what is the prefrontal cortex is self-restraint. So for example, if I see the banana and I see you and I decide not to go for the banana because you're there. So that's what the prefrontal cortex is, mostly self-restraint. It's like, I want the banana, but I also want to avoid getting bitten. So the simple answer is like a gorilla can self-restrain itself based on potential immediate threats, whereas humans can build mental abstractions to anticipate possible long-term threats.
Okay.
So, for example, if I do this, I may not get in trouble by getting bitten right now, but I may get in other kinds of trouble. And that trouble I've constructed in my prefrontal cortex because that can construct patterns that are not in front of me right now, but I can imagine them.
Okay. So here's where I'm still trying to work out my ideas, and maybe you can tell me if this sounds like there might be some merit to it. Like my whole idea around this masculine edge thing that I've been talking about on my channel is that there is a way in which we can tap in, men particularly, can tap into the more aggressive elements in our nature by constructing these abstractions around threats, things, threats to our control or dominance or status, where otherwise we wouldn't actually see them. So particularly using that as an internal tool. So learning how to see certain wayward emotions or ideas or tendencies as enemies that are seeking to control us, take our power away, because that's what kind of bad habits are. That if we let them, they will really mess up our lives. So what I've found is that through aggressively interacting with those things, as long as it's done in an intelligent and self-aware manner, it has given me significantly more internal control. So what do you think of that?
Absolutely. And let's be more specific about that.
Sure.
Everyone in the world has been rejected. Everyone in the world has looked at other people and thought, oh, they're above me. They're looking down on me. They're getting all the bananas. So
Yeah.
everybody, one way I learned this, I couldn't believe it because I had, same problems as everyone else.
Mm-hmm.
I had this book about how on a playground, somebody did a study, and even the most popular kids, when they went over to another group and said, can I play with you? They got rejected too. They got rejected less often. But the real difference was the unpopular kid, once they got rejected, they never asked again. So the popular kid asked more often.
Gotcha.
And yeah, so that's part of it. Another part of it is then that syncing with others, that we all choose how much we're going to do it. I personally chose not to do it, and then you accept the consequences, whatever. But the bottom line is, you don't need to torture yourself with these thoughts about how others are putting you down. That's cortex creating a pattern that existed in one moment in your life and pretending it exists every minute, which it doesn't. So to understand why, we need to understand about cortisol, the unhappy chemical. So cortisol is the perception that your survival is threatened. We've inherited this chemical because it promoted survival. So think of a simple example. Think of your caveman ancestors who were around fire all the time, and they didn't have helicopter parents, right? So a young kid is going to get burned in a fire once. Now, maybe they don't, even if they don't touch fire because their parents protect them, but they may have touched a hot rock or something that had been near a fire. You get burned, you feel pain. Pain is cortisol. Cortisol immediately creates huge neural pathways. And the next time you see anything related to something that gave you pain in the past, even vaguely related, your brain says, whoa, don't go near that. So you can see how social pain, when we live in a basically safe world and we're not constantly getting our bones broken and starving, social pain is what preoccupies us. So any social pain is in the animal world. If you're excluded from the group, then a predator is going to get you. If you're excluded from the high-ranking individuals in the group, then you're going to get less reproductive opportunity. So bottom line, social pain is a survival threat from your brain's perception, as long as you don't have bigger survival threats going on.
So from that perspective, then, in our comfortable modern, world, the social fear, that's the biggest monster that's lurking in the closet inside of us, right? That's the big one that most of us need to confront.
Yes. So whatever social pain you had in your past created a circuit, and the electricity in your brain flows like water in a storm. It flows into the pathways you have. So as you take in the world in your pattern-seeking brain, one of the patterns that's there is that most painful moment of your life. So that's where your electricity will go unless you really work hard to redirect it. Now, what is that most painful moment of your life? It's going to be a moment that happened, not just the pain of the cortisol, but in your years of peak neuroplasticity, because that's when those circuits grow most easily. Now, when is our peak neuroplasticity? It's before age 8 and during puberty. So, why is it during puberty? Because in the animal world, it's amazing that animals avoid inbreeding by moving to a new group during puberty. And when you move to a new group during puberty, you have to learn a new way home in the dark. You have to learn new faces and new ways of finding resources and new social hierarchies. And that's why life feels like high school, because every one of us wired ourselves during puberty.
Interesting. That's really interesting. So, the patterns that you like, your brain, it's trying to help you out. It's making you extra sensitive, so that you can learn a whole bunch of new stuff. But you also tend to pick up some, maybe patterns that don't really serve you super well, because a lot of these connections, like you said, they're kind of formed unconsciously based upon your experiences. Is that right?
Yes, yes.
Okay.
And everyone has the same problem. It's just we all learn different tools to manage them.
Right. Excellent. Excellent. So yeah, and that's a big piece then of what I want to concern ourselves with here in this project is how to help men particularly deal with, whatever kinds of problems they're going to be, confronted with. Now, one of the other concepts that I found super interesting was this idea of junk status. Could you tell us a little bit about that?
So I'm obviously making the analogy with junk food.
Yeah.
So junk food is something that doesn't serve you in the long run, but you may have this perception that you just got to have it in the short run. Why do you feel like you got to have it in the short run? Well, partly because it meets needs immediately from a primal brain's perspective, but also because, curiously, um, it distracts you from perception of threat. So this is complicated but very important. So let's say my cortisol is turned on. I feel like my life is threatened because I see something that reminds me of a past threat.
Hmm.
In that moment, anything that distracts me relieves the threat. So, for example, if I'm running from a lion, if I think about a tropical beach, that doesn't save me from the lion. But if I just imagine the lion, then when I think about a tropical beach, it makes the lion go away.
Right.
So that's why our brain is so um, motivated by distraction. So anything that saved you from a lion by distracting you in the past, you're always looking for more of that because it actually worked. Now, it's important to know that our brain is always deciding, is it more important to seek reward or to run away from pain?
Hmm.
Now, in the state of nature, running away from pain is more relevant to survival because you could always survive without your next meal, but you can't survive if you're eaten by a predator. So, in general, we avoid threat more than we seek reward. But there's an exception because if you pass on your genes before you get killed, then your genes are inherited. So if sometimes animals risk their lives for mating opportunities because that's the only way that their genes have survived. So that's the conflict.
Okay, so it sounds like your brain prioritizes threats and dealing with them because, it doesn't deal with them, then you could end up dead and not pass on your genes. But if it runs away from too many threats and doesn't take any risks, well, you also might not, pass on your genes. So there's kind of like this balance here. Now, so going back to this junk status concept, how does that, is it just a distraction or is there, like what would be an example? Because I feel like, there's a bit more there.
Okay, good. So people are looking for some fast ways to meet a need, but our need for social importance or status, there's no easy, fast ways to meet that. So if you just say, I'm going to eat an ice cream every time I feel bad about my status, we know that's not going to work. If you say, I'm going to, watch TV every time I feel bad about my status, that's not going to work. So people look for things that are going to work a little better. So one thing would be to show off. Like every time I feel bad about my status, I'm going to let people know how wonderful I am.
Hmm.
that could work or not work depending on how well you pull it off. Now, you could say, I'm going to let people know how stupid they are to put myself up. Well, that might work in the short run. In the long run, it's not going to work. So junk status would be a way that makes you feel better about your status in the short run, but really works against your well-being in the long run.
Okay, excellent. So, like the most obvious example then would be kind of like that typical bully who puts someone else down to put themselves up. That's some junk status there. But it also shows up, like how can this relate to morality?
Well, I can think in my mind, this one's a jerk, this one's a jerk, this one's a jerk. And then I'm better than everybody else, then I don't have to worry about it. Or I can think, I'm going to get a bigger car than you have, and I don't care how I get the money to get the car because then I'll be having social importance.
Right. Right. So this is a concept that I guess we didn't hit on yet, but your status is dependent upon where you fall within what you would call a dominance hierarchy, right? So you got these
Dominance hierarchy in your personal mind.
Personal mind, right, right. So one dominance hierarchy that we don't think about a lot around status is morality, and that's kind of what we're talking, or what one I'm interested in is that people compete, particularly today in this outrage culture, to say, I'm so outraged about this, or I'm so offended at this, that increases your self-perception of your own status within that moral dominance hierarchy. Is it fair to say that happens?
Yes, and I think that's a kind of junk status, once again, because it's a way that a person can instantly feel good about their status in the short run. And if it hurts them in the long run, they don't get it. That's often what happens with all of these junk addictions is we don't get how it's hurting us in the long run. So those people who are always in this outrage culture, how does it hurt them in the long run? They're constantly bitter. Now you could say, well, it's hurting other people too, but then that's an endless discussion. But first, one thing I want to address is when I said that it's the dominance hierarchy in your mind that matters, because there is no real dominance hierarchy in the real world. Now, most people wouldn't believe me, so let's talk about that. I don't know how, I'm interested in your opinion about this too, and I struggle with this issue. So it's easy to watch the news and think that there is a dominance hierarchy in the real world. Mm-hmm. But the reality is that you're creating that dominance hierarchy in your head by choosing which information sources you let in. And the way I've made peace with that in my mind is that if you see someone in the real world who appears like, oh, they've got it going on, they're getting everything
right.
Well, they're paying a price to get that. And do I want to pay that price and do what they're doing? And a lot of times I say, no way, I wouldn't want to be doing that. Right. And a simple example that you might think of is think of someone very powerful and successful that you might perceive like, and they may spend their whole life sucking up, like every minute of their life, they're sucking up, they're saying things they don't agree with, they're spending all their time alone in a hotel room and on planes. They're not having the life you want. Now, if I would have the life I want, well, then if I put my energy into this, I can't put my energy into that. So instead of trying to feel like I have to control the world in every minute, why don't I just accept that there's a lot of randomness and just be happy to just look for some positive feelings, not just to do bad things in the short run, but just to look for some short run happiness as well as some long run satisfaction with myself as a good person.
Yeah, and I think that's right where I'm at. Like the way that I see it is that I would say there are objective dominance hierarchies. Like objectively, some people are better at football or stronger than me or whatever. So like there is an objective comparison there. But what I think it is like, is your limbic system plugged into that dominance hierarchy? And that's where I see our power of our human, our cortex or whatever to be really useful, in that we can shift where our emotions are plugged in. And that's the power. And so like the question then becomes, all right, well, what dominance hierarchies do I want to be plugged in? Which ones will actually serve me and my higher interests?
Yeah. And here's the thing about the football player. Now, number one, they're spending their life, in order to be a football player, they're spending their life energy doing things that you may not want to do. But
Right.
the other thing is, are they really happier? And pick up a
Right.
tabloid. They're not. That's why I've said in the book, tabloids are public service announcement because they help us understand that these people are not happier than us,
Right.
right?
Right. Right. So, that's really what, I want to take people to, is to get to the point where they can develop their own hierarchy of values, and that's what they compete in, just against, their ideal, in a sense, where, you the way it sounds with this neurochemistry stuff is you got to earn your good feelings on a day-to-day basis by taking good actions, right? And so if you want to feel good regularly, you got to do good regularly. And sometimes, the challenge is when your emotions are plugged into systems that aren't really actually good for you. So like, we're talking about junk status. And so for me, junk status would be like participating in outrage culture, porn use for men. A lot of that, they can kind of pretend they're being this big sexual stud when in reality they're not. And be addictive. And then video game usage, you're pretending that you're really good at, you're earning this skill in this game that, if you invest too much time in it, it's actually probably counterproductive. So,
Here's,
go ahead.
can I just
Yeah.
people may wonder, like, why am I so drawn to plug into these reward systems and status hierarchies that are not good for me? And a lot of people recognize that they don't want to do it, but why do they repeat it? So it's really useful to understand the physical neural pathways that motivate us to keep doing that. So should I explain that a bit?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, so it's real physical pathways that got built from past experience. So when you're born, you have billions of neurons, but they're not connected to each other. Now, all of these people who are out selling consulting services, they're telling you, oh, yeah, we can grow new neurons all the time. Yeah, but those neurons are tiny, little, skinny new ones. They're not connected to anything. Your brain doesn't like them. Your brain likes the neurons that are already built into superhighways because that is what feels natural and safe to us. So when you try to redirect your energy into a new direction, you have to activate a skinny, unconnected neuron and get electricity to flow down that neuron, which takes effort, and you're not used to that. So that's why it's so hard to do something new. And when you understand that, then you know that in order to do something new, you have to stop doing the effortless thing and stop doing anything difficult and challenging so that all your energy is available to focus on that one new behavior. And if you do that for 45 days, then you will build up that new pathway enough that electricity can flow, and it will be easier because it's like paving. You will physically connect the neurons so that the electricity can physically flow more easily.
Right.
An old pathway will still be there, and it will always be bigger, but you will at least have built enough of a new pathway. It's sort of like if you carve a new trail in the jungle, that at least you can see the new footpath. It's not an 8-lane highway, but at least you're not having to slash it every day, but it's a visible path.
Right,
Okay?
right, exactly. And this is what I've seen repeatedly in my work with helping men recover from porn addiction. I've seen it in myself and I've seen it in clients to the point where, there is, obviously it's difficult to do this kind of work, but you can get to the point where you've built a new, it seems to me, a circuit around your old circuit where you actually fundamentally change the way you perceive something. So, if you do this stuff systematically and intentionally enough, like, so when I can see porn, I can watch porn and be, unaffected by it, uninterested by it, and I've seen clients do that too because they've done the work. So it's, while it is harder, while those old pathways do exist, you can build a new circuit on top of it that kind of nullifies it. Is that right?
Yes, but people vary in their ability to do this, partly because of what are the big superhighways you've already built in your early years that you bring to this. The reason I mention that is because, as you know, there's a big debate within the the alcohol recovery community, some people think,
Once an
yes,
addict versus always an addict, like kind of thing.
versus the person who, yeah. And it differs by individual. So I don't want to be saying, yes, just, you can have one drink and you'll be fine, because some people can and some people can't. It's a matter of the other pathways that you have to feel good and to feel safe. And
Well, so
that's where you focus.
So that's an interesting thing. I've had a lot of talk with people who coming from the Alcoholics Anonymous or Sexaholics Anonymous, coming in and saying how I don't subscribe to the once an addict always an addict mentality, but I do say that for some people, it's going to be more energetically efficient for them to treat themselves like to just never touch it again. It's going to be easier for them, because I believe that if you really show up every single day, you got someone, like for some people it's going to be much harder to build that complete tolerance, like completely getting to the point where they could have a drink again. Like that would just be so hard, it just would be completely impractical. But I don't think it's necessarily impossible. So it's like, I think that depending upon your level of motivation, your level of personal development, and all that sort of stuff, you're going to need to make an intelligent decision about whether you're going to blacklist a behavior versus whether you're going to try and moderate it, or if it should be moderated at all.
Yes, absolutely. And as you know, part of it has to do with your social context. Are you getting your social rewards by being with other drinkers? And are you thinking you're going to be able to still keep your old friends and only have one drink when they have a lot of drinks? Or are you just thinking, someday in the future, I'll have a glass of champagne at my wedding, but otherwise, I'm not going to revolve my social world around alcohol. So those are two very different, the same thing. But I just want to mention, I went to recently alcohol recovery, an addiction recovery conference, and was told that the person who created Smart Recovery is now in jail. She killed someone while driving while intoxicated. So that's interesting.
Oh wow, that's terrible.
Yeah. So the way I explain it in my videos, and there's 7 5-minute videos, and the 7th one is about filling your toolbox of self-soothing skills. So instead of focusing on to drink, to not to drink, porn, no porn, is what other self-soothing skills can I build to fill up my toolbox of self-soothing skills so I don't overuse any one of them? Because any one of them, if you overuse it, like, the whole deal about like coffee, if you love coffee, but then if you just rely on coffee for self-soothing, you're going to have a bad effect. No matter what you rely on, it's not going to always work. So you need as many self-soothing skills in your toolbox as you can.
Right. And that's why I think this status stuff is so important, specifically within, anyone dealing with addiction sort of work or trying to make serious habit change. Because from what I see around this kind of stuff about habit change, the entire conversation is about dopamine. But serotonin plays a huge role. If you can learn how to be satisfied, in other ways and engage those other feel-good neurochemicals, you're going to be less reliant on, jacking up that dopamine to kind of make yourself feel better.
Yes, absolutely. And so maybe I'll mention like what were my self-soothing skills in the serotonin department.
Sure,
And by the way, I should, just to confess, like, we all go through our path. So, when I was young, I was thinking that education would be the way. And I got a PhD, and I have to tell you that PhDs are the most bitter, competitive, sniveling, angry people. I was a wreck being around them. So please do not think that by getting paper credentials of any sort that you're going to escape this problem. And it's not just PhDs, because if anybody who's been around, doctor, lawyer, Indian chief, any group that has some pride in its professional credentials has the nastiest status competition within that group. And it's just the way it works in animal groups. It's amazing. So there is no way out of this. And like, excuse me for using a personal example, self personal development coaches have some nasty social
Oh,
dynamics.
sure, for sure. When I see a successful like YouTube person or someone who's giving a good talk, that part of me is like, why aren't you doing that? Look at them. And I start picking out everything wrong with what they're doing, how I would do it better. Yeah, no, this is totally a part of it, and you just got to be honest about it. And like, if you can integrate that competitive part and make it work for you, I think that's a huge power source.
Yes, exactly. So that's why I said that I realized that no matter what I did, I was always going to struggle with this.
Hmm.
So I have some personal solutions that I use that I may just mention
Yeah,
that
please.
may help people, or it may give you an idea of something else. So one thing is I don't watch the news and I don't check my numbers. Now, I know that's like totally anathema to what everyone does, so I'll just put that out there.
Okay.
um, I know now and of course, I'm in a different, life situation because I took early retirement. My kids are grown and they're tax-paying adults, and so I have different needs. The other thing, um, the urge to compare is always there. So who can I compare myself that I'm going to feel okay with? So I compare myself to my ancestors because my ancestors had horrible lives.
Yeah.
So I can always compare myself favorably to my ancestors. Now, when I've discussed this with other people, especially young people, they have this fantasy that their ancestors had these fabulous lives, and it's
You thank
just not.
paleo for that.
Yeah. And so start doing some research and finding more accurate information.
Yeah.
And the final thing is to rewire my pattern seeking brain. So if let's just here's a Godonk, a thought experiment. If I go to a maitre d' in a restaurant and they're going to give me a table, and then I could sit there and think, oh, he gave me the bad table and other people got the good table. You could sit there and look around and say, oh, that table is better, that table is better. Or like a high school thing, like I'm at the bad table and it always looks like the other table is better. But if you do a thought experiment and put yourself at every one of those other tables, you could find the negative side of those other tables. And after all your effort to get to the other table, then you'd still be unhappy. So why not just look for the positives of whatever table you're at? So if you're at this table, it maybe is quieter but has a worse view. And another table has a better view, but it's louder. So why not just enjoy today I'm at this table and I'm going to enjoy the advantages of that. And tomorrow I may accidentally be at that table and I'm going to
Right.
enjoy the advantages of that.
Yeah, and that's the power of mindset right there. The ability to look at this stuff, to have gratitude, to reframe your situation, and which can impact the way that you feel dramatically. And the thing though is, correct me if I'm wrong, but our brain has a what would you call it? A preponderance to look at lack or out of a survival tendency rather than to look at the good things. So it's like, in order to start becoming more grateful and feeling better about your situation, it's going to take intentional conscious work. It's not something that your brain will naturally do for you. Is that right?
Yes, thank you. That's the subject of my book, The Science of Positivity. That's my latest book, The Science of Positivity. Stop negative thought habits, but stop negative thought patterns by changing your brain chemistry. And it's so hard to get out of positivity because it is one of the core ways that people bond with each other. And it is the way that animals bond with each other. Because when animals don't have predators, they just trot off to greener pasture. So it's the awareness of predators that keeps them together despite the nastiness within the group. And it's so easy to see that human social groups, they keep themselves together by obsessing over the perceived predator.
Hmm. That's interesting. So what's the solution then to having strong social connection? Do you have to always have this common enemy to fight against, or what?
Good questions. Really tough. Really tough. And then this is the topic of the new book I'm working on.
Yeah.
Uh, and I think, in one sense, everyone has to define it for themselves because the sense of strong social connection that you built during your years of neuroplasticity with those superhighways, for most people, it's hard to just throw those all in the garbage and say, I'm going to just ignore all my old bonding strategies. So we really somehow need to build on our old bonding strategies in a healthier way.
That's really
So
interesting. So, like, from what you're saying here, you know, how we've got all this stuff that's been conditioned in us from our past experiences. You know, everybody's journey is going to look different, and the way in which they're probably going to have the greatest emotional success, as it were, is through working within their own story, not trying to like learning how to look at your path, what you've gone through, and then creating, you know, that good state within that, rather than just trying to run away from the past or reject it or pretend it didn't happen. You know, you've
or
got to
the
integrate it.
opposite.
Right.
Yeah, or do the opposite. Some
Like just
people
focus on it. Yeah, sure. Yeah. Yeah.
exactly. Yeah.
Excellent. Excellent. So I think this is a great spot to end it. I want to thank you so much for you know, coming on the show and you know, sharing your insight. This was really fun. So make sure you tell everybody where they can follow you and you know, check out your books and all that.
Yes, please go to the Inner Mammal Institute. It's innermammalinstitute.org, and I have lots and lots of resources. Just click on everything, and there's a huge variety, and I look forward to hearing from you, and I'm happy to answer people's questions.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Loretta Breuning, everybody, and see you next time.
Thanks. Take care.